Prime Minister insists his party's latest housing policy won't push up house prices, despite one of his ministers saying it would, temporarily. If re-elected, the coalition will allow first home buyers to dip into their superannuation to put towards a deposit capped at $50,000. Labor has joined superannuation groups in criticising the move, saying it will further fuel Australia's housing affordability crisis. The coalition is defending its policy to allow first home buyers to dip into their superannuation to purchase property. The Minister for Superannuation, Jane Hume, has conceded the policy could result in a short-term bump in house prices, but argues this is outweighed by the long-term benefits. The scheme has been criticised by Labor, the superannuation sector and some economists, including Saul Eslake. Jane Hume was asked about Mr Eslake's criticism when speaking to Michael Rowland on the News Breakfast program this morning.
A lot of respected economists are a bit unhappy with this, including Saul Eslake, a prominent independent economist. He says your policy makes him want to scream, his words, because he says there are 60 years of history showing that by doing this, by promoting demand for houses, will drive up house prices but not extend housing ownership in Australia. What do you say to people like Saul Eslake?
Well, Saul Eslake already owns a home. In fact, he probably owns more than one. When Saul Eslake was buying his first home, it didn't take that many years to get together a deposit, but interest rates were higher. Now interest rates are much lower, but getting together a deposit can take up to a decade. This policy will allow people to dip into their superannuation savings temporarily, take it out to help save for a deposit on a home, but then when they sell the house, they put the money back into superannuation, plus any capital gain that they've already made. So it helps them improve quality of life in their working life, gives them security of owning their own home and stability, but then also they save money for their retirement as well.
And economist Saul Eslake joins us now from Hobart. Saul Eslake, welcome. You're generally very measured with your comments, but you've expressed your frustration with housing policy before, saying it's been badly handled for decades in Australia. How does this latest policy commitment on housing in Australia, allowing people to use their superannuation, make you feel?
Well, it's not as bad as the reduction in capital gains tax on investment properties that the Howard government implemented in 1999. It's probably not as bad as the Howard government's decision to extend first homeowner grants to purchases of established housing after the introduction of the GST, even though the GST didn't apply to purchases of established housing. But it's a contender, apart from those two, for one of the worst housing policy decisions of the last 30 or so years. We have, as you alluded to in your introduction just then, almost 60 years of evidence that, in my view, shows unequivocally and uncontrovertibly that anything which allows Australians to spend more on housing than they otherwise would, be it first homeowner grants that were first introduced in 1964, stamp duty concessions by state governments, tax preferences for property investors that were expanded under the Howard government, shared equity schemes, mortgage deposit guarantee schemes, or this one, anything that allows Australians to spend more on housing than they otherwise would, results primarily in more expensive housing rather than in more people owning that housing, that is, in higher home ownership rates. And I've often asked myself, why do politicians of both political persuasions, not just coalition ones, continue to do things that disadvantage the people they say they're trying to help, namely aspiring first home buyers? And the only plausible answer I can come up with is that for all the crocodile tears that they shed about the difficulties faced by aspiring young first home buyers in getting their first foot on the property market ladder, they know that in any given year there are only 100,000 who succeed in that pursuit. And maybe if there are 4 or 5 who fail to achieve that goal for every one who does, there's maybe 400,000 or 500,000 votes for policies that would restrain the rate of property price inflation. But politicians also know that at any given point in time, there are at least 11 million people who own at least one property. Within that, there are more than 2 million who own more than one property. And contrary to Senator Hume's assertions, I'm not one of them. If she had an ounce of decency in her, she would have checked the facts before playing the man, or indeed not played the man at all. And even if I did own more than one property, I'm not in the habit of tailoring my views on public policy issues to suit my personal financial interests. Maybe lots of Senator Hume's friends and colleagues are, but I'm not. The point is that politicians know there are far more votes in policies that push up house prices than there are to be had in policies that restrain the rate of growth of property prices. And John Howard was a pretty astute reader of the mood of the electorate. That's why he won 4 elections in a row and became Australia's second longest serving Prime Minister. He would occasionally say that no one ever came up to him on his morning walks saying, please, Mr. Prime Minister, would you do something that makes my house cheaper so that someone else can afford to buy it more readily? The reality is that politicians of both political persuasions know that there really aren't many votes in doing things that would help first home buyers genuinely, whereas there are lots of votes to be had in pursuing policies that make existing property owners richer than they already are.
But is this madness?
Well, madness might be overstating it. I said yesterday when I first heard this policy, echoing something Kevin Rudd said during the 2007 election campaign, that this reckless inflation of house prices must stop. But 40 years of following the housing market tells me that however desirable it would be to stop it, politicians aren't going to stop it because there aren't any votes for them on net in doing it. I wish that politicians and others would look at the evidence, which, as I say, I think is uncontrovertible that these policies don't work. Even Senator Hume herself conceded that the policy she's now defending would cause a bump in property prices, which will disadvantage those who aren't able to arrange their affairs in order to take up this scheme, perhaps because they don't have enough superannuation savings stocked away in order to do this. Matthias Cormann, who was finance minister in the Abbott and Turnbull government, said in 2014, when this idea was last floated by some Liberal backbenchers, that it would not work and would make the problem worse. Malcolm Turnbull said the same thing in 2016. The overwhelming majority of all of those who don't have a vested interest in ever escalating property prices is that schemes like this are counterproductive.
The federal government argues this will be a win-win because when people sell the house, the amount taken out of super will be put back in with the commensurate capital gain. What do you make of that argument?
Well, that depends on whether property prices continue to rise at a faster rate than the prices of the assets that superannuation funds typically invest in. Now, over the last 20 or 30 years, that has been the case. That is, that residential property has outperformed a combination of stocks, bonds, infrastructure assets and other things that super funds invested in. But precisely for that reason, people should perhaps be sceptical that the same thing will happen over the next 10, 20 or 30 years. As financial products always say in the fine print at the bottom of product disclosure statements, past performance is no guarantee of future returns. And indeed, one of the additional risks with this policy is that it will encourage people to take money out of their superannuation savings, leverage it up, because what they take out of their superannuation savings will form part of their deposit, which they can then borrow up to 4 times as much in an additional mortgage and take on that additional debt at what we now know is the bottom of the interest rate cycle and what may also be the top of the property price cycle. That may not be a good thing from individuals' long-term point of view.
What about the point that using super would reduce principal and interest that you would pay off over time with a house?
Well, it might do that. Well, it might actually, if people use the super as the deposit to get a bigger mortgage, they may end up paying more in interest than they would have done if they hadn't taken up this scheme, because they end up buying a bigger house, or, as I suspect is likely, paying more for a house than they would have done had they not had access to these additional financial resources. I mean, consider also the government scheme which it introduced during COVID, allowing people to take money out of their superannuation fund in the second quarter of 2020 and the third quarter of that year. With the benefit of hindsight, that was probably the worst possible time for people to be taking money out of superannuation funds, and those who've left it in bank deposits will, I think, very much be regretting having done so. They may well feel the same about taking money out of their superannuation savings at, as I said, the bottom of the interest rate cycle and potentially the peak of the residential property price cycle in order to put more leveraged money into housing than they would have put into superannuation. The people who will benefit from this most are people who already own at least one property. And as I say, there are far more of those than there are people who would like to buy one for the first time. And that, I think, is the only plausible explanation why politicians of both major political persuasions keep keep coming up with schemes that contribute to ongoing property price inflation rather than schemes which genuinely help people who don't own a home at the moment.
Yeah, so you believe this will inevitably lead to an increase in property prices, but the government argues that it's got this other policy announced yesterday incentivising downsizing for older people. What do you think about that being balanced against this policy?
Well, taking those two policies together, what they illustrate, in my view, is just how much the coalition dislikes Australia's system of compulsory superannuation, presumably because, in their view, it gives unions a greater role in the economy than their declining membership would otherwise entitle them to. And the only virtue it sees in superannuation is using it as a vehicle to allow older Australians to pay less tax than they otherwise would, which is something that they have been doing on and off since 2001 when they've had the chance to. Allowing people who crystallise capital gains of several $100,000 to put that into superannuation in their 60s, for example, when they will therefore pay less tax on the income which that generates than they would if they kept it in their own names. This is just a policy that allows senior Australians to pay less tax, something that's been going on for more than 20 years, despite the fact that the share of household wealth owned by Australians over the age of 65 has risen from a quarter 18 or so years ago, now to well over a third, which is a significantly greater increase than the increase in the proportion of older Australians as a percentage of Australia's total population. And this adds to intergenerational inequity, and in that sense, I think is regrettable as well.
The Prime Minister just held this media conference pointing to the number of first home buyers that have got into the market over the past couple of years because of his policies, saying you can't argue with that. What, in your view, what is the best way to help younger people get into the property market, if not this?
Well, I think there are two things in broad terms. One is, as the inquiry chaired by Jason Falinski recommended earlier this year, state and local governments, possibly with financial incentives from the federal government, should be doing more to boost the supply of housing and reducing the costs incurred by builders and developers, which they pass on to home buyers, of bringing new housing onto the market. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that government should back away from policies that in different ways they've been pursuing for almost 60 years of needlessly inflating demand. So get rid of first homeowner grants that I call second home vendor grants, because that's where the money typically ends up, replacing stamp duties with a more broadly based land tax that economists say would lower the cost of, lower the price of land. Obviously, that would be wouldn't be well received by the 11 million people who already own a property, but it would do a lot, I think, to help aspiring would-be first home buyers. Do what the Labor Party had advocated at the last two elections of scaling back negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount for property investors. And on that, I make the point that the American variant of negative gearing was abolished in 1986 by the administration of Ronald Reagan, one of the heroes of the conservative side of politics in Australia. The British variant of negative gearing was abolished by the Conservative government of David Cameron in 2016. This is not something that purely left of centre governments do, but has in fact been done by Conservative governments in the two countries whose tax systems are most similar to Australia's. So that sort of thing would help. And not having crazy schemes like the government's mortgage deposit guarantee scheme that encourages some of the most vulnerable people in our community, single parents and so forth, who can only scrape up a 2% deposit, encouraging them in effect to go into the property market on very thin margins of equity at, as I said before, the bottom of the interest rate cycle and potentially the top of the property price cycle. It's as if no one remembered what helped bring on the global financial crisis beginning in the United States 15 to 16 years ago. It was precisely doing that. So, when you're in a hole, as we are with regard to housing affordability and home ownership, the best thing to do is to stop digging. That is to stop pursuing the policies of constraining supply and inflating demand, which governments of both political persuasions at federal and state level have been pursuing on and off for the last 60 years. We've got 60 years of evidence that shows that those policies don't work. Surely it's time to try something different.
Saul Eslake, thanks so much for talking to us, and presumably you would suggest to politicians in future not to get personal in these discussions?
Well, I certainly try to avoid getting personal about politicians, and I think it was regrettable of Senator Hume to play the man, so to speak, to use a footballing analogy. I would welcome an apology for her for her factually incorrect statements about my property in ownership, and it would be even better if she apologised for suggesting that what I say is influenced by my own personal financial interests, which they never have been. But, I suspect I'll hear the AFL announce that Tasmania is going to have its own team in the AFL before I get that sort of recognition from Senator Hume.
We'll see what happens. OK, Saul Eslake, thanks so much for talking to us this morning from Tassie.
That's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.